Well, guys, this is going to be a really interesting interview. I am dead sure. Spent the morning with Steve, and hopefully he's going to give me as good a chat as he did earlier. I'm with Steve at the Radio Communications Museum of Great Britain up here in Derby. It's a new museum that will be opening shortly to the public and radio groups. The call sign, you've also got a GB2 RCM special event call sign, Steve. But tell us your own call sign and then a bit about how you got to come up with this idea.
Right, well, my call sign is G8EBM, Echo Bravo Mike, England's best modulation.
Yeah.
But I've had that call for nearly 50 years now, so quite a long time. Started as a youngster, interested at school, and then really have been active ever since. And probably about 10, 15 years ago, I was looking with a friend at rebuilding some, an old radio. And I went to buy a sample of this radio. It was a radio I'd had as a young lad. And when I got to the amateur's house that I was buying this old military radio from, it was quite surprising because he had a row of Eddystone radios. Now, Eddystone isn't a name we kind of hear about much now, but back in the 1960s, they were absolutely the bees and E's. And as a schoolboy, I could never afford anything approaching that. And when I saw these really good radios at this guy's house, I suddenly realised that I could now afford to buy them. So that really made me go back home. I should say, the guy didn't want to sell those radios. He sold me the old Army radio. But anyway, then I started looking in the magazines for some Eddystone radios. And I eventually found the one I was looking for and did the deal. And that was the start. And by the start, I mean, I now have over 200 different models of Eddystone radio. But the collection then started to grow, and now we have over 2,000 radios in the collection.
Well, I know what you mean about Eddystone radios. I owned one for a while, and then I moved it on because I wasn't using it, and I felt it was wrong of me not to let somebody else have the enjoyment I was having from the particular one I had. British made, they were engineered beautifully. When you rolled the tuning dial, it was weighted and it moved. It just oozed quality, don't they?
Well, in many respects, it was the mechanical side that really outstripped the electronics, and in many respects, the radio performance was not as good as some of the competitors, and quite often on ships, it was the second receiver, and there was another receiver which would be classified as the primary receiver. But the mechanical construction was superb, and that's been a real bonus because that's given a very long life to these radios, and it means you can restore them very effectively and bring them back to as good as they were when they were new.
Yeah, they certainly are. Now, 2,000 radios. Are you planning to get any more? I mean, we've got a massive selection behind us. Very, very impressive. I assume it's an ongoing love.
Yes. I mean, we're now being a little bit more kind of specific on the radios we're looking for. We are really trying to focus on English manufactured radios. That's the kind of the primary. But really any radio that's been used within the UK. This has really meant that, I suppose, initially I was looking at what I'd call commercial radios, not amateur radios. So this meant the military and also government use was typical. And of course, the government will primarily source in the UK, but often will source from overseas. And that really meant that the collection as not just a British collection.
Yeah. Well, as I say, you kind of split the grouping a little bit into amateur radio stuff, and most of what we can see behind us is amateur radio. As you said, you've got commercial, you've got some military gear, but you've got some really, really interesting models in amongst those. And you know, I think the guys and I have wandered around with you this morning, and we've literally had our mind blown away on this.
Yes, it's interesting. We've within the collection we've got some radios that are unique. So, for example, in the amateur radio market, we've got the KW2000D, the Delta model, of which only two were ever made. One is at Bletchley Park, and I'm pleased to say we now have one in our collection. But we had to go all the way to Australia to get that one, so they really are rare. And some of the other radios, the actual radio model isn't necessarily rare, but the way that particular radio was used, it makes it unique. So we've got a number of military radios that were used in some quite exciting environments.
Yeah, you certainly have. You certainly have. But you started off, and it's nice, you run a communications company, and this is kind of your hobby part of that now. And you were telling me about you started off by having a tower on a piece of land earlier on, and you've got repeaters up there and all that sort of thing, haven't you?
Yes, that was really a business by accident, you could say, in that it was a site that the local amateur radio club used for VHF National Field Day and events like that. And another amateur and myself thought it would be really good to have some form of permanent structure on top of this hill for amateur radio purposes. But it was just at the start of the cellular phone expansion, and we were able to in fact put up a mast that was used for cellular, and that mast now has been up 40, nearly 40 years, and we've really been able to not only use it for commercial purposes but for amateur purposes, and we've just gone live with the 5 gigahertz beacon. So look for GB3 RCM, and that's up on 5 gigs.
So that's phenomenal what you've been doing, and it's very interesting. I mean, you told me the story of earlier on that you've been in amateur radio 50 plus years. You told me that you learnt most of your amateur radio information from books purely because it was 2 bus rides away as a youngster to get to the local club, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, I started getting interested in amateur radio when I was probably 11 or 12, and the local radio club, I lived in Nottingham at the time, and I was in the southern part of the city, and the amateur radio club was in the northern part, and it really meant that it would require 2 journeys, 2 bus journeys each way, and so I decided really not to go there. And most of my learning experience was actually listening to people on 80 meters. And there was a particular net that used to be on every night. And I learnt so much because they would talk about what they'd done during the day, uh, building antennas and testing things. And every day I got practical education, really. And so I was lucky with that, plus reading the books. I got my RAE, as it was then.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's one thing that's kind of missing a little bit in this hobby is today is there's not people don't tend to do their apprenticeship as shortwave listeners. They don't tend to listen to the radio. They go get their license, which is a different way of getting it. But in the earlier days, going back a few years, you did predominantly do a lot more on shortwave listening, didn't you?
Oh, yes. I mean, I would say that every night I spent several hours, probably when I was supposed to be doing my homework, but I had the radio on in front of me and I would be tuning around not just the amateur bands, but the shortwave bands in general. And that certainly was a kind of a key interest for me. Whereas now, uh, most children are more IT based, and so it's computer related things. Um, and as I mentioned earlier, we do run code clubs here at the museum, and we're finding that some of the children who come to the code club, they then choose to do our electronics course, then they join our technology club, and as part of the technology club, they can take their foundation license. And we've got a group going through at the moment. In fact, only this weekend, a group of them they sat their practical exam, and I'm pleased to say they all came through with flying colours, which is excellent.
That is excellent news. And the thing is that amateur radio is now not the mainstream hobby it was, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago. But when the youngsters realise that a lot of the computer things and the things they're doing, and they start to realise that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and mobile phones are radios, then it's aiming them in the right direction, and they often want some form of communications to link devices together. So I think amateur radio is a good thing. We might not get all of them into the hobby, but what you're doing of having code clubs and electronics and amateur radio certainly gives a youngster quite a good grounding, I would suggest.
Yes, I mean, we actually hold part of the code club in this room. So while they're programming their computers, they're surrounded by radio equipment, and it's inevitable people say, well, what does that do and how does it work? And so to be able to switch it on and explain that is brilliant, really, because um, they are completely unaware of amateur radio as a hobby, and to be honest, they really don't think of radio as a technology, because broadcast radio they hardly ever listen to because they stream everything over the internet these days. And it is interesting that because we've got a mobile phone section of the museum, the children engage with that first, and they don't realise that a mobile phone is a radio receiver and transmitter. It's just that they haven't thought about it. So it's obvious once they you tell them. But equally, the same with, as you mentioned, Bluetooth and well, just general Wi-Fi. I mean, it says it in the name, but Wi-Fi is still just something you do on a computer or on a mobile phone.
Yeah. It's kind of one of these things where it's a black box. Something happens, and it really is for a lot of people. Well, it's magic. But as you do your amateur radio course, you learn more about the the hobby, and you get a greater insight. So I think what you're doing is absolutely great there.
Well, I must admit I'm getting a great buzz out of it. The children really are enjoying it. I mean, they don't have to come to these clubs. This is in their free time, and really the biggest problem is at the end of the session, you kind of getting them to go home. That's fantastic. And what it does show, though, that if you open children's eyes to science and technology, they are keen to learn. And we've got this huge shortage in the UK at the moment of engineers, and I'm sure that part of that is children just have not been given the opportunity to understand what's out there. And I hope that we can do our bit. But it's only part of what the museum does. Education is a very important part, but we're also working with people at the absolute opposite end of the age spectrum as well.
Well, that's good. That's certainly good because everybody needs something to keep their brain active. And as you say, with youngsters, it's once you show them something, they will soak it up. And I think I've come on this conclusion many times is I think the reason today sometimes our hobby's a bit excluded is purely because if you're a group of people in a room and you and I have got handy talkies on our belt and we pull them out, most of the people in the room won't understand what we're doing. So you'll get some bright spark who is unaware or ignorant of what we're doing, but doesn't want to look a fool, that will take the mickey out of us, will harangue us because he or she doesn't understand. And the rest of the sheep will follow. Yeah? But I find when you ever show somebody a piece of technology and you explain what it does, they're actually very, very interested. So I think what you're doing is good.
Well, yes, I think what is interesting is youngsters, their brains are like sponges, and you only have to show them something once, and they get it. And once they get it, they're suddenly very, very keen. And they've just not been exposed to radio before, and so we're giving them that opportunity. But with the older people who come to the museum, either as volunteers or just as visitors, then there is an opportunity to get them to be aware that amateur radio exists and just how they can become part of it.
Which is very, very good. Now, you mentioned to me, and we will at some point in time wander off into your workshop where I will promise not to dribble on the floor again. Um, you did say to me that you came across a problem purely after you started setting up the museum where some of the radios have EPROMs in them and they are something you told me that I didn't know about is EPROMs only hold their charge for a certain amount of time, and then they literally almost start bit flipping and wiping themselves clean. So you've been doing some work there, haven't you?
Yes, well, quite a lot of the what I call professional radios, so these were aimed at the military or government users, uh, they were a piece of electronics with a kind of a relatively simple piece of software in them, but the software, the program, was stored in this thing called an EEPROM, which basically is a device where you can write the program and it's held electrostatically inside the chip. Now, the chip's life is only kind of guaranteed for kind of 9 years. And the reality is the radios were generally designed to have a service life of 7 years. So there was a buffer. But we're now keeping these radios alive, 20, 30 years after the manufacture date. So it's not surprising that some of these chips are starting to fail. Now, when I say fail, they're not actually breaking. It's just they lose the information that's stored in them. And in fact, if you can rewrite that information, they'll work again quite happily for another 9 years. So it's vital that you can take the program out of the chip while it's still working, put it onto a computer, and then when you need it, you can rewrite that information back into the chip to give you a new lease of life. Now, we came across this by accident. We found one of our radios suddenly started having faults on startup, and we looked at kind of what the problem was. We soon realised that it was the EEPROM. We were able to take the EEPROMs out and put them onto an EEPROM reader that was connected to a computer and was more sensitive than the electronics actually in the radio. So we were able to extract the program and then re-encode the very same chip with the same program but with a new static charge. So in fact, we kind of overwrote what was there before. We realise that this is going to affect lots and lots of people because these radios are all going to be failing in the next few years. So it's our plan to have a library of all the EPROMs we can get, and then we can offer a service to people where if they do lose the contents of their EPROM, they'll be able to come to the museum, bring the chip with them, and we'll blow into it the version they need. Now, when we get some of the manufacturers of equipment had very many different variants, even of the software, even within the same apparently similar product range of radios, because depending on the customer, they put different facilities and features into the software. So what we would recommend is that people actually take the radio apart, take the EPROMs out, and either read them themselves on a computer or bring them to us, and we'll read their program and save it for them. And so we really could be a backup insurance policy for people with these radios. As I say, they're the radios that were in the 1970s and 80s and even into the 90s. That era of radio is the most susceptible, and we believe that's going to be a good service that we can offer the radio community.
So certainly is. Now, what I'd say, just as a caveat of what you said, because I don't want people giving you a hard time, if you don't feel comfortable taking the EPROMs out of your radio, don't do it. Get somebody who does know what they're doing, because we're not taking responsibility for this. Number two, by giving you that piece of information means that I'm sure lots of nice radios that would have come up in the next few years at rallies as not working and very, very cheap, I'm no longer going to be able to buy because people know that they can flash the EPROMs again.
Yeah, that's very, very, very true. What is interesting, of course, some of the radios which were perhaps being sold with limited features, if you now put a different program that was originally devised for that model of radio, you can now re-enable the features that were effectively cut out.
So very, very interesting things there on that. And yeah, we're going to move on now to another area and show you a bit more of the museum. But great piece of information we've imparted in just this short bit. It'd be nice to start looking at some of the stuff you got here, Steve. This transmitter, you tell me it's a 2 kilowatt naval transmitter. On wheels, phenomenal. But tell me a bit more about it.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. It's the weight of it is one of the most interesting features, because we had to go and collect this from another amateur who wanted to sell it, and he had got it located upstairs in his house. I'm not quite sure how he managed to get it up there in the first place, but anyway. My son and another amateur helped me manhandle this down. We did take it apart to get it down the stairs, and anyway, we brought it over to the museum. And over here, of course, we've got a lift, so that made it a lot easier to bring up into the operations room. But it is a fully working amplifier. Well, I say amplifier, it's actually a transmitter, because it has, as a complete unit, a single sideband transmitter. It can also be used for RTTY, that type of transmission as well. But US Navy, this particular one, we're not sure of the kind of the history of it. So whether it has been to sea or whether it actually was on land. I suspect it might have been on land because of the lack of significant vibration mounts. But the previous person had put it onto a frame at the bottom with wheels, and that's made it a lot easier for us.
So it's a mobile 2 kilowatt transmitter.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, pretty good.
So one of the things that you did tell me before we move back a bit further is in this museum, It's not like when you had it built, it's not like a new normal building. You've had to have reinforced floors, you've had to have extra beams put in because when you start having things this size delivered, you got to be safe, haven't you?
Oh, very much so. And in fact, in this particular room, we knew we were going to put a whole row of equipment racks, so the weight falls straight down, and the point load is quite significant. And this building, therefore, is not just a steel frame building, but we've got an RSJ, for example, running straight underneath where these um, racks are. So we've really got good support. And the flooring is all concrete beamed, reinforced concrete beams. So built for the job.
It certainly is, certainly is. Now, moving just down the line just a little bit, this transmitter here, it was general military use, you say?
Yes, I mean, it was built by Rakel, and it's an interesting. Well, this part is the amplifier. These are 125 watt modules, so you've kind of got 500 watts, 500 watts. So as a kilowatt solid state uh, unit, and then that you could, in the top part of the rack, you could put different units, and you could actually have a transmitter, as this is, so we can transmit, probably used for teleprinter circuits. That's typical use, and this unit itself, the transmitter, only generates 250 milliwatts to go into the amplifier. So it's relatively kind of low power at this stage, but again quite a heavy weight. And when this is on, the forced air cooling is quite noisy.
I can imagine so. And I think as an amateur, and this is one of the things that got me, is you're talking about tele-data networks, teleprinters and data being floated around. And I wouldn't have thought of that. So that's my ignorance. But there are all sorts of things out there. So this is very interesting to me.
Yes, I mean it's uh, uh, obviously Rakel designed it to be a multi-use piece of equipment, but probably whoever bought it, if it was, I think this one was probably RAF, but it was then used for one specific purpose. And although it could support single sideband, AM, and teleprinter, it was probably only ever used in one mode. Uh, that's typical of the Rakel equipment. But as such, it works. It generates lots of power.
Yeah, as I say, it's nice you've got. It's not. It's nice you've got this stuff. Now moving down the rack. Unfortunately, without reading the labels, and I'd have to put my glasses on, I don't recognise very much of this gear in here.
Yeah. Well, this gear is quite. Some of it is quite rare, so you don't see them generally. And part of the idea of the museum is to actually have equipment that is unusual, and it's to give people an opportunity to see stuff that they not only haven't seen, but probably weren't even aware existed. Um, and the way Rakel designed things, it was very modular, and you could plug different pieces together to get different configurations. So you have for here a monitor facility, a scope, which allows you to look at the both outgoing and incoming signals. But the bottom kind of half of the rack is all a receiver, and it's a VHF and UHF receiver, um, and you can effectively select the frequency band you want to operate, but also either manually or automatically it will select the most appropriate antenna that it's got in its antenna bank. So this could be connected to half a dozen different antennas, and as you change frequency, it'll change the antenna for you. But one of the features of this particular radio was a remote capability, which is interesting because at the moment everyone's talking about operating radios over the internet. Well, this has all before the days of internet, and this was remote operating using telephone wires. So they could send a serial encoded signal down the telephone line to control the remote receiver. And this also gave the operator the ability to have multiple receivers in multiple locations, and there from one command point they could in fact control all these remote receivers, either tuning them in a synchronized manner or individually, however they wanted to. But again, equipment that was professional radio, probably still is. You wouldn't really use this for amateur radio purposes, but we think it's nice to have it in the collection because it is an unusual radio.
Certainly is, and having like a smart antenna switch that selects the right one, and remote control, early remote control, it's just interesting. And I defy any amateur not to be interested if they see that. That's good. Right. So as we move further along the rack, Steve, I recognise these lovely Raycol receivers. They look almost brand new, so you've had a great restoration job done on them. And to use them, they've got like a film canister that display, which rolls backwards and forwards in here, so that you always have a linear scale. This knob here adjusts, it says megacycles. For those of us older than 1970, the people will say megahertz, but megahertz or megacycles. And then this side you have what says kilocycles, which is kilohertz, which is the top scale, and you can dial in smack on the money with these. Really nice receivers. These ones you have here, I would suggest, look brand new. So you've had a great job on them.
Yes, this particular rack of equipment, it's got several kind of different pieces of equipment in it. These in the middle here, the RA17 or 117 receiver it's a valve receiver, so it's back in the killer cycle days, as you say. And it was the staple receiver used by the RAF, other military organisations. GCHQ use them, so very widely used. What is interesting about these particular radios, they've all been restored for me by Rob Philby, who he's sometimes known as Raycol Rob because his expertise, but he's G0MJR, and he is probably one of the leading specialists on this series of Raycol equipment, because that was what he did in his day job. He used to maintain and support these bits of kit. So we've been very lucky for him to help us bring these back to really as new condition. Also, if we go further up the rack, we've got quite an unusual piece of equipment at this level, and this is a frequency standard. And if I open up the little door, I don't know whether the camera can kind of see in there, but what we've got is a very, very accurate source of frequency, and this allows us to lock the various receivers together and also very accurately determine the frequency that we're looking at. So when you think we're talking 1960s and early 70s technology, to have that capability at the time was really quite staggering. Another feature of these radios, because if you remember, the old valve radios used to drift their frequency, especially as they warmed up. But even if you left them on for an hour or two, they would often drift. Well, these didn't. This is what really stood these apart from other manufacturers. They were very, very stable receivers. So you could go to a frequency and know it would stay on there. So if it was being used for surveillance purposes, you didn't have to have the operator stuck in front of the radio. He could set it up and then walk away knowing that it was going to stay on that frequency, which was really quite important. But this equipment, there are kind of different modules that go together. So if you're going to resolve single sideband, because the receiver as it comes out the box, as you might say, is really designed for AM and Morse code. But if you really want to resolve single sideband, they had what they call a single sideband adapter. And you could then select upper and lower sideband, and there's a fine tune just to bring people onto frequency if they're slightly off. So that's good. But the interesting thing, as we go further down, we come to a transmitter, and that transmitter, same series, again generates 250 milliwatts, and that goes into an amplifier.
Right. Okay. Well, that's very interesting because I've seen the receivers. I didn't know about the SSB adapter, and I never knew they made a transmitter. So the hobby's so big, and I have an interest in lots of things, but I never knew they did that. So once again, the museum is well worth a trip because you're going to find out so much more about lots of things that will actually improve your knowledge across the board, I suggest.
Well, certainly from what we're trying to do at the museum is really try and have as wide a display as possible of all the different things, so that technologies that have come in and now gone away, we still want those to be on display. Otherwise, they'll be just lost forever. So quite important to capture those kind of days in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
Yeah, and the thing is that we now have solid state, integrated, computer control, blah, 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 blah. But they pretty much, a lot of the stuff was designed very, very early on. It's a bit like the superheterodyne receiver, designed in the 1920s, still being used today. And, all right, it's not valves, it's solid state, but the principles are the same. And if we don't understand where we come from, how can we understand where to go to?
Absolutely, yeah. No, you hit the button there, because really tomorrow's engineer has to be aware of today and what came before, because so often an idea that was probably difficult to perform 10 years ago, we now can perform that easily with digital techniques. But it's knowing that there's a requirement there. So I think it's important for all engineers to not only know about what they're doing now, but the history relating to their field of engineering.
Certainly, certainly. Now, another rack here. I don't recognise anything in this rack. I could sit and read the labels, I suppose. Hey, that says Eddystone. That's one of your favourites, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this whole rack is Eddystone, in fact. Now, Eddystone, they did make some amateur radio gear, but a lot of their equipment was aimed at the marine radio market, either to be on board ships or to be on shore stations. And again, modular approach. We've actually got several eras. So we're spanning several decades here of Eddystone equipment. The latest one at the bottom, which is microprocessor controlled and digital display, and we've then got kind of a linear analog display and so on as we go up. But we have monitor scopes that allow us to look at the signals that are being received, and we have some receivers that are designed to only operate on specific frequencies. So if we look at this one here, this one right at the top of the rack, the original frequencies that it was set up on are still on the front of the panel, and they're round about 2 megahertz. So they were in the marine band at that point. So those could have been at a Coast Guard station, and you could select all the different marine channels just by hitting the one switch. Um, but quite often that would be left either monitoring the emergency channel in case someone was, in distress, or it could be that there was a frequency that related to that particular company who was using the equipment, because um, it's kind of early radio telephones, really, but for marine.
So I would guess, based on this, this is crystal controlled. These would be crystal controlled rather than a VFO, I would suggest.
That's right, yes.
So, yeah, certainly a lot of Eddystone stuff that I've never ever seen in my life. Uh, most of the Eddystone stuff I've seen are the big receivers that you come across at rallies.
Yes, well, we've got over 200 items of Eddystone equipment in the museum. So in this room, the operations room, all of these can be powered up and used. They will be all connected to antennas. That will be happening over the next few months. Whereas in some other areas of the museum, the equipment is on what I call static display, where it's a traditional museum display.
Well, that's good. Moving further down the rack, with these racks here, Steve, I don't recognise anything in here either, so you're going to have to help me out.
Well, there's quite a few different manufacturers here. We do have a Raycall lurking in the middle here, but if we go to this one, this is quite an interesting radio. It's a VHF and UHF radio, manufactured by a company called Nems Clark, which most people will not have heard of. A very small number of these really were made. This one came from the White Sands Missile Testing Facility in America, where, which I think is Nevada, where they tested the all ranges of missiles, not military missiles, and also those that were used on the Apollo missions. With a lot of testing took place, and the telemetry from these missiles came back to receivers such as this. So they were not receivers that you or I would have ever seen, and we wouldn't have even known the company existed. Now, this company was taken over, as often happens in the specialist radio kind of manufacturing market. You find that one company at a certain point in time is stronger than the others, and it acquires its competitors. So this rack and the next rack has equipment where the company that bought this one then built some other equipment. This one down here below the Raycall is a cubic 3030 receiver. This one is actually badged Marlborough Communications because it was bought, I believe, for the RAF at the time. I'm not quite sure why it was imported under the badge of Marlborough, but it is a company that is the Cubic Corporation. Two separate receivers in one rack slot here. HF receivers, really quite ahead of their time and very sensitive, and quite a joy to use, actually. That's one of my favourites. Now, the item below, some amateurs will certainly recognise the manufacturer name because it's Drake. Now, Drake made the TR3, TR4, and the TR7, a whole range of amateur radio transceivers and transmitters and receivers in the 1960s and 70s. Very, very popular. But they also made some radios for what I call the commercial marketplace. So these were for communications purposes, not many were sold, and I don't think it was all that a successful venture. I think they stepped out of the area they were kind of strong in and went into an area to go head to head with the people like Cubic, and I think probably came up short in reality. Now the next one, that is more amateur radio. This is an ICOM radio, an R9000. You often see it as a tabletop receiver, and it's LF all the way up to 2 gigahertz. So quite a wide spread. Again, a radio I really enjoy using. And this came out, it must have been the 1980s. And what is interesting, the display on here is actually a cathode ray tube. So it's not an LED display. And we actually had a spectrum scope, something we've got really used to with SDR radios and waterfalls. Well, back in the day, there were only a handful of radios that had this facility. And ICOM, with this receiver, the R9000, and the transceiver, the 781, they were really in the market of their own, and brilliant bits of kit. And below that is a piece of Collins equipment. Now this was made, the 51J4, it was an AM and CW receiver, but you could have an optional single sideband adapter, rather like when we talked about the Rakels. But Collins themselves didn't manufacture it. It was made by another company who saw the opportunity and sold these to go alongside the Collins. So it was interesting how kind of one company would live off the back of another company, really. But again, we're lucky to have got these because they weren't many made, and not many came to the UK. So that was quite a find for the museum.
You certainly done well there. You certainly done well there. And as you were going down, I spotted the Drake, and I thought, that's something I haven't seen before, that particular model. So you got some nice Drakes on the other wall, which we've looked at earlier, which is very good. This last rack, once again, I'm sorry, but I've never seen any of this stuff before.
Yes, well, this comes back into the same stable as the Nems Clark. This is all Watkins Johnson, and now this equipment was phenomenally expensive. This equipment was made again in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And as we go down the rack, we get to the latest one at the bottom, which is solid state. This is an LED display. There we're kind of into solid state and valves, and you've got different eras really of equipment. But these were typically used by US government agencies such as the CIA for their listening posts, and they were designed to be very sensitive, very low noise, very stable, and very expensive.
I'm afraid they look extremely expensive, you know. If you had to choose which was the most expensive rack, this one certainly looks it.
Yes, and it was. I mean, this one at the bottom actually came out of a BBC monitoring station, which was closed down, and they had racks of these, and these were, you know, tens of thousands of pounds. So even on the eBay market, you know, you're paying several thousand, well, between 1,000 and 2,000 for those. Sometimes you even see them go up to £3,000 or £4,000 on eBay. I think that's a little optimistic. Whether the deals actually go through, I don't know, but certainly some people get into a bidding frenzy for them because there are so few of them available. Now these are all going to suffer from the same EEPROM issue that we discussed earlier. So we will be protecting all the EEPROMs in these radios by putting the code from the EEPROMs into a computer database, so we can always pull it back in the future.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely brilliant. Well, it's an interesting few racks. We're going to move on to another part of the museum now, and my only concern is that we're not we're not going to show people so much that they never want to come and see you. But it's going to change all the time, isn't it?
Oh, there's more equipment coming in, and as I said today, we're still building the museum, and half, well, we've got twice as much again as you've already seen in the museum in storage. So we've got a lot still to do.
Well, it's not just about radio communication here at the museum. There's also a collection of mobile phones. Now, Steve's been telling us that they use mobile phones like displayed in cabinets like these to bring young people towards the communication part of it. So they're not just things that are used for gaming and playing Minecraft on etc. or sending Snapchats. It's about talking about how the Wi-Fi radio works and how Bluetooth works, etc. The museum has a host of phones, and I've got to be honest, yeah, many ones that I haven't owned, but I know many of our team have. Phones here from Nokia, going back even as far back to probably prehistoric phones, even before Snake. For those of us old enough to remember phones without Snake and pull-up aerials on some of these phones, including, as say, device well from Motorola, particularly the Razr, a phone I always wanted and never got the opportunity to get one. There's also Blackberries as well, as I say, and also then to say even pagers as well are being donated to the museum to show children, I suppose, the history of the mobile phone and how it's progressed over the years, as I say, as a communication tool for the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth and how that works. Now, Steve tells us as well that not only is this obviously a talking point from probably kids come in and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe you use one of these phones, Grandad," but they use this as well to introduce children to the coding courses that they have here as well, teaching kids the joys of writing code for technology. And then that also as well generates a passion across all modes of communication. And recently they're working on their first batch of students for the UK amateur radio license. So it's another interesting way of bringing young people into the hobby and get them involved. So as I say, the museum does appreciate donations from people. So if you have an interesting mobile phone in your shack or your cupboards or your drawers that you're sitting there thinking, I don't even know a charger for that anymore. I wouldn't even know what to do with it. They say, I'm sure the guys here at the museum would appreciate your donation. There was a brand here, they say that I don't remember seeing. There wasn't a lot of things like Philips. I think Philips briefly had some mobile phones, and I don't see any Philips here, and things on those lines. So there's a bit of Motorola, there's a bit of Sony Ericsson. There's plenty of Blackberries, interestingly, maybe some corporate donors, etc. I don't see a Nokia communicator. There was a phone I always wanted. As I say, and I've just seen one of my colleagues looking around because I think he's just realised what a Nokia communicator was as well. I have to ask if he ever had one. But even one of the very first mobile phones I ever saw, mobile phones that didn't do text messages. Try convincing that of children. Mobile phones didn't do text messages, didn't know Snapchat. So it's certainly an interesting collection of devices here. I say to show people, I say that method into the communication hobby.
Well, we've now moved to the workshop area in the Radio Communications uh, Museum, and I think this is actually electronic heaven. I would love one of these. I am envious of you totally. But all the test equipment here, great looking stuff. One of your favourite places, Steve?
Yeah, it's pretty good in here. We've really got two, I suppose, different areas. There's some historic equipment that really we'll seldom use, if ever. So we clean it and put it on display on the upper shelf over there. But then all the equipment that's behind us at the moment, this is all being used or capable of being used. And some of it, when we're servicing the old radios, uh, we're using obviously the shall we say the standard things, signal generators, oscilloscopes. We've got a valve, two valve testers here as well, which are important for the old radios. But we've got one or two items of very specialist equipment that you only need now and again. But when you need it, wow, it's brilliant having it. And for me, yeah, this is nice. I feel lucky that I've been able to create this, and not only for myself, but the volunteers who come into the museum, Because what we say to the volunteers, if you give your time to the museum, if you want to come along and build some of your own equipment or test and modify other equipment, we're quite happy for you to do that. You know, if you're giving your time to the museum, then the museum can give back to you. But also, I mean, we've got one guy who comes in on a regular basis, and he retired some years ago, had been in electronics his whole life. When he retired, that was like the end of his electronics. And then he came across us almost by accident, and we've kind of been able to give him a new lease of life in that part of his world. And he's very, very capable, and I think he's enjoying himself. I hope he is. Certainly we're enjoying having him being part of the team here. So that's really good.
Yeah, that certainly is good. Well, you know, you mentioned volunteers. You know, you can't do it all on your own. Let's be honest about it. And it's exactly the same with us in the podcast. We can't do it all on our own. So it's nice to have a group of volunteers around you. How do people become a volunteer? Because I assume you want not just electronics engineers, but people in all sorts of fields that can help you with the museum.
Very much so. On our website, we have a list of the jobs we need doing, and this ranges from helping us in the web area and social media and shall we say the things perhaps the younger people might be more interested in helping us with. We've got people who are helping us build benches, and there's one guy at the moment. He is just brilliant at putting together all the frames for the shelving we're putting up. And he comes along and spends an afternoon a week with us doing that, and he's making a real difference. And that I think is nice. But do you know what else I get a real buzz out of? Is seeing them round a table with a coffee and a biscuit, enjoying coming here, because it's like a social club as well. It's a social club for techies, and what is good, you don't have to be an out and out techie. You can just be a techie in terms of your hobby and your interest, and still get a lot out of coming here. But we've got another type of volunteer. Now, this type of volunteer doesn't come here that often. It's someone who can volunteer and help the museum dramatically, but by doing it while they're at home. Now, part of that could be, for example, someone helping us on web work or social media. But also, we're trying to do research into every bit of equipment that we've got on display. And we really need people who've got the time, and it doesn't have to be a huge amount of time, but they'll pick a particular radio and say, right, that's the one I'm going to do research on, or a particular manufacturer, and we will effectively be creating a database that anyone will be able to access. This is the important thing. We're going to be just a resource that people through the internet will be able to log on and find out not just about the equipment we have, but the company or companies that were behind the development and then the use. And then finally, another type of volunteer is someone who's looking at it from the user end. You know, if someone has used one of these pieces of equipment, a good example will be someone in the military who's used a particular radio. What, you know, was it effective? You know, was he pleased with it, or was it incredibly heavy on his back? And you know, you really didn't like using it at all. That kind of information would be really good. So we're very keen to get as many volunteers involved, and people can give just a few hours a week, or they can come. Well, they could come 3 days a week, and we'd be over the moon.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that sounds absolutely brilliant. And I can understand you saying about people enjoying and building a team. It's kind of like us at the podcast. I'm using an example. We're here in Newark this weekend, and we have a great time. We like each other. Outside of when we're podcasting, the whole team across all countries. are great to work together. In fact, we've been described as a virtual radio club. But I can understand why the volunteers do get excited because they share knowledge.
Oh, absolutely. And do you know what is interesting? In fact, the guy I just mentioned who's been coming, he actually was licensed as a radio ham many years ago. He took his RAE, passed it, got a license, but never went on the air. He was so busy at work, he didn't go on the air. Anyway, since he's been coming here, he's now got his old call sign back. Mind you, that was not straightforward. He had to go through quite a rigmarole of proving through City and Guilds that he'd passed the RAE and everything else. But that's been really good. And so he's got something out of it. And I think it's a win-win situation. And certainly, as far as I'm concerned, I only want people to come here and be volunteers if they're enjoying doing it. That's the whole reason for doing it.
Well, the whole thing about our hobby and from what you're saying, your museum, goes down to one three-letter word. And before the boys shout at me and throw things at me, it's not going to be rude. It's fun. If you don't have fun, you don't do it.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think when I look back, this whole project of building the museum has been fun. There have been a few challenges on the way, and one of them being EMC interference from the LED lights, but we overcame it, and that's great. And I look at what we've got ahead of us because we've got so much we want to do, but I need lots of help. So yes, any volunteers out there? Yep, we're certainly looking for you.
Well, based on today, and I'm going to say, you've got one very important helper. Your good lady. She's been here today supporting us. It's a Sunday we're recording this, so we'll let her secret out. And she's been here all day, very hospitable. But I get the body language and all the things she said, that she's very supportive of what you're doing. So you're a very lucky man.
Yes, I think, to be truthful, if I didn't have her support, I wouldn't be able to do it, because I do spend a rather lot of time down here these days.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I wanted us to say that because I genuinely believe that is the truth. Looking around your bench, though, I'm in awe. I mean, I spent my first 10 years working life as a radio TV engineer, then moved into being a computer engineer for a while. And I got rid of a lot of radio TV engineer stuff. I'm about to cry because I had a Mullard valve tester, the one with the cards, you know, Paxlin cards,
Yes.
2 boxes of Paxlin cards, the whole thing. I don't win.
Got one of those downstairs.
I promised not to dribble over it. But things like that, and my signal generator, my colour bar signal generator, which covered the whole of VHF and UHF and all sorts of things. And you think, why did I get rid of them now? Because they would be so useful. But I thought I got into computers and that was it. And I didn't expect to come back into amateur radio. And when I did, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. But you got lots of stuff here, and invariably, you know, you've got one of the best equipped workshops I've seen. So if somebody is wanting to be a volunteer, this is one of the best places to be a volunteer.
Well, thank you very much for those comments, and I just feel that we're doing two things with this workshop. A, the old equipment, we're making sure some of it lasts and stays into the future, but also using it. I have to say, it's been quite a big learning curve for me on lots of the equipment because I've not used it before, and that's a challenge, but then that's what life's about, isn't it?
Certainly is. So you have in this room phenomenal lighting, let's be honest. And as I get older, I find that I need a good light. So I could work in here comfortably without having to have my angle poised light on the subject. It's also nicely air conditioned. You've got ideal benches with electrostatic points on them. Completely, absolutely ideal workshop. So I must congratulate you on this, and I'm sure you'll be the envy of many amateur.
Well, thank you very much, and it was great for you to come.
Well, as we've given you a great flavour of the Radio Communications Museum up here in Derby, and I can say that talking to Steve, it's only going to get better. I don't see how he can make it much better, but he says he can. So, in fairness, we're about to wind up. Well, I've taken a lot of Steve's time today, but Steve, tell us how people can get in touch with you, how they can find you, your website, that sort of thing.
Right, well, if we start the website, it's really easy. It's radiocommunicationmuseum.org. So that's the first one to hit with. If you want to send us an email, I should say, if you go to our website, you can then click on for our newsletter or to put your name down as someone who wants contact in the future when we actually open. And if you want to volunteer to help us, again, you can do that all on the website. So that's one way. If you want to send us other information, then info, I-N-F-O, at rcmgb.org. So it's a shorter email address.
So that's good, and that's ways of contacting you. Now, you told me, but I wanted you to confirm it, you're opening shortly to groups of amateurs and then a bit later on to the full public. Is that correct?
That's right. We're aiming probably in it's spring 2020 to open for groups of our radio amateurs. At that time, all the upper part of the museum will be open, but the ground floor won't be. However, we don't mind taking small groups, well, in fact, any size group really, round the ground floor, but just remember, it's not a museum at the moment, but it will be upstairs. So the plan is that we will open fully the whole museum by 2021, by the end of 2021.
Right, so a lot of work to do. And what I would say is, guys, if you are a radio club, certainly in the UK, certainly in the Midlands, you should be booking this one in your diary to come and see the museum. And even as far south as we are, we'll arrange, we'll tell our boys and see if we can get them to move their bodies up this part of the world to come and see you, because I think this is brilliant.
Well, that'd be great. And of course, with the Newark Hamfest being this weekend, and it's finishes on Saturday, then people can always come here on the Sunday, because what we will do is open on a regular basis on the Sunday after the Hamfest.
Well, that's you heard it first from yourself, and that's a really good use of your time. So, listen, I've taken so much of your time, but thank you very, very much, Steve, for giving us the time and been an enjoyment.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to see all your orange-clad team all here together. Great.
And we didn't blind you with the colour then.
Yeah.